Hello there. We're going to start today with a broad question. What are global public goods? Well, they are often simply described as public goods whose benefits, costs, or both have a global reach. And this is a pretty good place to start. And now, I expect in your own thinking about the list of goods that I set out in the 3-minute task, that your characterization of these goods as global public goods or not really depends on the extent to which you deem them to be rival and excludable at the global level. And I've just got a little quote here from Paul Samuelson, and he is the professor of public goods, and he defines public goods as collective consumption goods which all enjoy in common in the sense that each individual's consumption of such a good leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption of that good. And so here, the word all enjoy in common, it really means all humans on planet Earth. So this sounds pretty straightforward, yes. Well, of course, maybe not. So again, kind of reflecting on your own thinking about the list of potential global public goods, you've probably already realised that goods that we might think of as global public goods can be quite slippery or quite difficult to categorise. They can differ in a number of ways. For instance, how impurely public can a global public good be? Do global public goods merely have to be available to all, or do they have to be enjoyed by all in a kind of utility sense of the word? And really the way that we respond to these types of questions is important because the way in which these global public goods are defined can have major implications for how we might design our analytical frameworks for understanding global collective action, and how conclusions from those frameworks really end up in some sort of policy. So we're going to spend some time in the rest of this video really grappling with some of the conceptual and definitional issues regarding global public goods. Well, unfortunately for us, an agreement on sort of a standard definition of what global public goods are does not yet exist. And it's probably worth mentioning, actually, that if you decide to do more of your own research on this topic, you'll probably find that different authors refer to the things we're discussing not only as global public goods, but also international public goods, transnational public goods, as well as the global commons. And sometimes this is really just kind of semantics, but at other times these different labels or the different ways that we categorise these types of goods are used to make certain analytical distinctions. But first we're going to talk about what makes a global public good global. So we can think of global public goods as potentially comprising 3 dimensions. And the first dimension is perhaps the most intuitive one. So global public goods have a kind of spatial dimension where global in this case must be used in the sense of being comprehensive or all-inclusive, where the public effects of having or not having the good span several geographic regions or even the globe as a whole. So this kind of spatial dimension to global public goods, emphasising the global. The second potential distinguishing feature of a global public good is that they can have impacts that go beyond state borders. And so we can think of this as an action that one country might take, or an action that individuals take within one country, can have positive or negative impacts in others. And so these other countries, they might have invited these impacts, so they might be kind of good things, or they might arrive in their countries without permission, so to speak. So these impacts might also be felt quite differently in different parts of the world, and we'll pick up on that point or elaborate on this a little bit later. But I guess another potential dimension of a global public good is that often these types of goods are stocks rather than flows. So, if we consider the atmosphere for an example, changes to the atmosphere in terms of flows have been gradual, but the stock, the availability of the global public good that we have now is really related to what's happened in the past, and the effects will unfortunately, extend well into the future, so affecting multiple generations, which also raises difficult issues of intergenerational justice, of course. Now, this also, again, we'll pick up on this point a little bit more later, but it also raises tricky questions about who should shoulder the burden, who should shoulder this global burden or global burden sharing. And as I said, we'll pick this point up a little bit later too. But we can think of the globalness in global public goods as having three dimensions, or at least sort of what makes up a global public good. Perhaps this spatial dimension is the most essential one, but global public goods could comprise all three of these dimensions. Regardless, kind of according to this definition, global public goods are likely to be quite slippery customers since they don't really fit nicely into existing national and international governance systems. So even from this side of things, even just considering the kind of globalness of global public goods, we might expect that countries need to be willing to cooperate to provide them. And the fun doesn't stop there. So now that we've kind of considered the globalness of global public goods, what about the publicness of public goods? And that's where we're going to go to next. So I'm going to go back to the basic categories regarding the purity of public goods, but I'm going to update things slightly to bring it more in line with our global lens. And I'm actually using some of Ostrom's words in these tweaks. So first, I'm going to replace rivalry of consumption with subtractability of use. And second, I'm conceptualizing subtractability of use and excludability as varying from low to high rather than characterizing them as dichotomous. So essentially what we're doing here is that we can place goods on a scale of publicness, if you like, rather than them having to be one thing or another. So I have another task for you. I want you to go back to the list of goods I gave you in the 3-minute task, and I want you to plot them in this categorization matrix type space that we have here. And so thinking about their level of subtractability and excludability at the global level, and I want you to categorize them into these sort of 4 spaces, if you like. And then while you're doing this, you might want to also think about the global collective action problems each good might present. So pause the video here and take as much time as you need. And I just want you to kind of think through the logic. Which goods do you think go where, and what type of collective action problems might these goods pose at the global level? So pause the video and we'll return shortly. Okay then, so let's go through where we might position these various goods within this categorization matrix. So let's start with the atmosphere. Now I have the atmosphere around here as a global common pool resource because of its function really as a sort of carbon sink or a sink for other greenhouse gases. So currently, the atmosphere is a bit of a no man's land that is openly accessible and appropriated potentially by everybody. And it's very difficult to exclude people from using it in this way. So we've got a high difficulty of excluding potential beneficiaries. And I've also got it as high subtractability of use, at least thinking about nowadays. Perhaps in history we might have considered the atmosphere as having sort of a lower subtractability of use, but at least in today's times we've clogged it all up to a point where we're sort of congesting the atmosphere and its capacity as a sink is declining. So I've put its subtractability of use as pretty high, and I've categorised the atmosphere as a common pool resource. How about Antarctica? Now, this is a bit of a tricky one, an interesting one, and there are a number of ways that you might interpret the publicness of this particular good. So I guess you might see it as a global knowledge commons. Well, I've heard it referred to as that, or perhaps you might even think of it as a sort of a sheet of white that reflects solar gain back into our atmosphere and regulates sea levels. So thinking about the sort of the difficulty of excluding folks and its low subtractability of use, well, I guess you could even think about it as a sort of as a commons, but also you might think of it as, I'm going to put it down here and suggest why it could also be sort of in this private zone here. So if we think of Antarctica, as unfortunately it is being dealt with more recently in sort of global politics, well, we're kind of continually seeing this as a continent of resource exploitation, and so it's moved into this private goods zone here. So we've got countries who are saying we're going to exclude people from accessing it for the purposes of science, and we're going to extract resources from it. Obviously, it's got a high subtractability of use in that sort of way of looking at things. So we could actually classify Antarctica as an international private good, where countries, either individually or collectively, exclude other countries from using it and kind of extract the resources for private gain. So yeah, you could have Antarctica, I guess, in multiple areas here, but I'm going to put it here to sort of represent the geopolitics of Antarctica, kind of that's currently going on. I'm going to choose to focus now on global liquidity, and sometimes this is referred to as the global or international financial safety net. Now, there's an interesting recent paper that talks about this as a global public good, which is why I've really chosen it, and it's on the reading list if you're into that sort of thing. But I've put this here as a global as an international club good, and I'm following the paper on the reading list in that categorization. And again, there are sort of a few assumptions that are going to go into this, and you might reasonably think that liquidity has some subtractability of use. If you draw on the funds, they diminish. But in practice, lenders rarely, if ever, face real barriers to providing assistance to a state. And this is especially true when lenders can create their own liquidity, like the Fed or central banks generally. So I have liquidity categorised as low subtractability of use. And I also have it down as a pretty low barriers to excludability, because access to global liquidity is super political. So borrower states are, carefully screened, and many of them are not allowed into the club. So again, you might link this club good to, let's say, financial stability, which probably exhibits more public or global public good type characteristics. But I'm going to put global liquidity as this sort of sub-good, if you like, as an international club good. We face relatively low thresholds to excludability to these types of funds. Finally, let's look at climate change mitigation. So I'm not going to go through all of the goods. I'll leave you to sort of consider the remaining ones for yourself. But climate change mitigation, the archetypal global public good. So we know that there is low subtractability of use once this good is provided. It's provided for everybody, and likewise, it's very hard to exclude potential beneficiaries from climate change mitigation. But even this really depends on the assumptions we make about how it's produced. And so William Nordhaus and his work on climate change really hints towards sort of an international club good type approach to climate change mitigation. So under this proposal, a small group of countries would form a club and agree to undertake harmonised emissions reductions. And if you're not a member of the club, so non-participants would be penalised for not joining. And how do they get penalised? Well, through things like unfavourable trade situations, sanctions, or unfavourable trade policy with tariffs on imports and things like that for non-members into the club region. So even though Nordhaus is a Nobel Prize winner, I think this is pretty unlikely, since the countries who need to start the club and wield the kind of tariff stick are really the biggest emitters. So I think we can safely pop this in the global public goods section here. But my main point is really that kind of publicness and privateness are not really always innate characteristics of the goods themselves. So they often result in, or they're often the result of social and political choices. So goods might change their position along this public and private scale dimension. And we should always have sort of one eye on whether they shift and try to understand why, because this is going to help us understand why some global public goods get provided and others don't. So this has to do with the different collective action problems each different type of good really presents. So again, going back to our standard theory, this is the free rider problem. So when difficulty of exclusion is low, then we don't really have to worry about the free rider problem at all. But when difficulty of exclusion is high, the standard theory tells us that the free rider problem should ensue. So we'll go into that in a little bit more detail shortly. But before we move on to that, I just want to introduce another important element of conceptualising global public goods, an aspect that is often forgotten about in the textbook version of things. So while we've been focusing so far on the publicness of consumption, most global public goods, because of their global reach, are also public in provision, kind of in the sense that their provision usually involves a large number of actors that also span the globe. So I want to think a little bit more about that publicness in provision, as well as this situation, which is talking about publicness in consumption. So, like publicness in consumption, which is broken down along subtractability and excludability lines, publicness in provision can also be broken down in terms of how global public goods get produced. So a chap called Jack, and I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Hirschleifer, he first came up with this concept of what he called the social composition function of public goods. And so you might also see this in the literature referred to as the aggregation technology of public goods in general, but global public goods in particular. And this is really essentially looking at how inputs get transferred into a final public good. And so in our case, a final global public good. So what does this really mean? Well, I thought that it might be easiest, most illustrative to go through this by way of example. So we're going to consider 3 global public goods: climate change mitigation, protection from astronomical flying objects, and disease eradication. And now remember, there is no world government to supply these goods, so we have to rely on the cooperation of nation states to do the job. So we're talking about how do these 3 types of global public goods actually get produced. So imagine that we learned that the Earth will be hit by a massive asteroid 25 years from now. And so if nothing else were done to avert the collision, life on Earth as we know it will be no more. But there's a potential technical solution that would offer some protection against the asteroid hitting the Earth. So, we might be able to intervene so that we can alter the asteroid's orbit, let's say. And all it would take is a single best effort. So, do you think we could be confident that the funds needed to deflect the asteroid would be raised? Well, I hope the answer would be yes. We can think of the incentives to act here as being so strong that it would be in the interests of perhaps a single country to supply this global public good all by itself. So the global public good in this case is, protecting the Earth from this asteroid strike. And yeah, the fact that we will all die, that Earth itself will be no more, is this a strong enough incentive for one country to go, yeah, we'll take this responsibility on our own? And I think there's reason to believe that that would be the case. So, in this case, international cooperation isn't even needed at all. But these types of global public goods are what Hirschleifer identified as having a best shot technology. So where the overall level of the global public good equals the largest single individual provision level. So all it takes is one country to decide that they're going to take on the responsibility of providing the global public good. And in that case, like the global public good is either produced or not. And so the global public good itself equals the largest single individual provision level. This is called best shot technology. This is how this particular global public good is produced. Now, let's take the example of COVID-19 or the eradication of COVID, that is. I don't need to give you the news that COVID has killed millions of people all over the world. And while folks in so-called Western democracies are well into their vaccine programs, the vaccine is expensive, and of course, not everyone in all countries has access to it. And it would be marvellous, it would be good for the world if COVID was gotten rid of for all sorts of reasons, win-win. But the provision of this kind of global public good really requires the active cooperation of all countries. So things like isolating, tracking and tracing, but really vaccinating pretty much every incidence of the disease is going to be needed for it to be eradicated. And so successful provision of this kind of global public good really depends on what Herschleifer calls the weakest link technology, where the smallest contribution fixes the quantity of the good for the entire group receiving the benefits. And we can think about this in COVID terms, in the sense that we need to look at every single incidence of the disease in order for it to be eradicated. So, if COVID is hiding in nooks and crannies despite our best efforts in the West, then there's absolutely no hope that we have of controlling it. So it is this idea that it's every single bit of the disease that needs to be controlled in order to provide this public good in its fullest, or at least to an extent that we feel is desirable or that we're happy to live with. Now let's think about climate change mitigation, and this is a harder global public good to supply. So in contrast to our asteroid protection issue, climate change mitigation can't be addressed by one huge project. It's going to take lots of cooperation of all countries around the world to do it. And likewise, unlike disease eradication, it's not in the interests of each country to contribute so long as all other countries do so. So success for climate change mitigation really depends on the aggregate efforts of all countries. And this is what Herschleifer calls a summation type technology. So where each unit contributed to the public good adds cumulatively to the overall level of the good available for consumption. The summation, in this view of things, it could be quite simple. So if you imagine a linear sort of pattern, so 1 for 1, you contribute 1 unit, you get 1 unit of the good. But it also could be quite complex. So, we might think of the relationship as exhibiting diminishing returns, for instance, or sort of an S-shaped function. But here, the potential free riding is clearly much greater. So not only considering the public in consumption, but also the publicness in provision, sort of helps us to distinguish between different global public goods that require different amounts of collective effort, and also sort of what is the nature of that collective effort. So again, we can kind of link this to the standard theory of collective action and the free rider problem as it is articulated there. So some global public goods will pose more serious problems than others, and this is where we'll turn now. So given our assumptions about the way we conceptualise global public goods, it seems that goods that fall into the difficult to exclude category and which also have a summation type technology will pose the most serious problems for global collective action. Now the environment being a particularly tricky global challenge, I'm going to focus on the environment just as an example in most of what follows, but hopefully you'll see how the insights here can be applied to different global public goods and the ideas more generally. So what we're going to do here is revisit the payoff matrix that you looked at in terms of a public goods game, but we'll replace individuals with states. And in my universe, we have 2 countries. These countries are Moonrise Kingdom and New Penzance, and they are faced with the decision to invest in climate change mitigation. Or if we are thinking about the environment as a global commons, the decision of these states is whether to pollute or not. So we're kind of using these things interchangeably, but they're clearly theoretically distinct. But in the case of climate change, states are having to contribute in order to receive a total benefit that here, given the restrictions, exceed the cost of participating. And in the global commons case, the costs to the state is really the foregone direct benefit from not polluting. So it might also be worth mentioning here that zero here is used just for analytical purposes. In substantive terms, it means a bit of a free-for-all, if you like, lots of pollution, lots of climate change, but let's work through the logic and we'll see that in both cases we end up in a prisoner's dilemma type situation. So when both Moonrise Kingdom and New Penzance mitigate or refrain from polluting, both get the collective benefit of more mitigation or less atmospheric congestion, which is worth more to them than the individual cost of providing it. And we know this is the kind of collectively efficient solution. But how likely is it that this collectively rational outcome will come about if we assume that states are instrumentally rational maximisers? Well, let's consider the options to Moonrise Kingdom if New Penzance mitigates. So we're in this territory of the matrix here. So if New Penzance mitigates, then Moonrise Kingdom's best response is not to mitigate. Here, Moonrise Kingdom can effectively free ride on New Penzance's efforts and get B. And so we know, because C is greater than B, and you can think about the costs of climate change mitigation as being relatively, well, huge, wholesale conversion to renewables and things like that. So we know from this that B is going to be better than 2B minus C. So Moonrise Kingdom, in the case of New Penzance mitigating, gets some benefit without having to pay for it. Moonrise Kingdom's best response is not to mitigate. So how about now if we think of New Penzance as not mitigating? Well, again here, Moonrise Kingdom's best response is not to mitigate. So we're in the territory of the matrix over here now. And again, it's because we've got these conditions, C is greater than B. So this would leave Moonrise Kingdom effectively in the negative, so less than 0. And because the game is symmetrical, I'm not going to go into the details of the other side of it, we can see that the same is true for New Penzance. So likewise, New Penzance's best response to any move by Moonrise Kingdom is not to mitigate or to pollute. So this leaves us in the territory here, the classic prisoner's dilemma. And what this implies, sort of in this case, is that the global public good of climate change mitigation will be underprovided, and the global environmental commons will be overexploited. So indeed a bit of a dilemma, or kind of a tragedy, if you like, scaled up from individuals to the world. So this, I guess, finding or this reasoning makes global public goods particularly difficult to govern issues because for regular public goods, these dilemmas might be solvable in a number of ways, so perhaps with government intervention or perhaps through Ostrom's third way, but there is no full equivalent of the government at the international level, and this is what William Nordhaus refers to as the Westphalian dilemma. So what are we to do? Well, the literature is really awash with suggestions on what we need to do. But the question that we're going to be asking in the rest of this lecture is, why should we be persuaded by those ideas? And we'll consider whether Ostrom's ideas are available to us at the international level. So can we come up with some kind of voluntary cooperation scheme? What about the role of international institutions? Are international institutions, or robust international institutions, the answer to our problems? Well, really, kind of how valuable, how valid we think these solutions are is really dependent on the way that we conceptualize the problem, and whether we believe the sort of standard theory of collective action to be a reliable representation of how states cooperate, or why they cooperate, and more to the point, why they don't cooperate. And so this question is really going to be the anchor that we'll return back to in what follows. So yes, I look forward to seeing you there.